Would the Senator care to engage in a brief colloquy? And may I ask unanimous consent that we be allowed to do so?
The Senator from Rhode Island is recognized. Without objection.
I was here for your point about mental health and addiction recovery care. And as you will recall, you and I and others worked together to get the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act passed. And that was a very bipartisan effort because the scourge of the opioid epidemic fell across all Americans. And it was one of my happier and prouder moments when that bill actually got passed. And then when the Appropriations Committee came in behind the CARA bill and put funding in, but the bulk of the programs that we put together in CARA, bipartisan programs, were funded through Medicare, Medicaid. That's how you get reimbursement for those programs. And so, doesn't it seem peculiar that our colleagues on the other side who were so instrumental in pushing through that Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act to help their constituents at home and who at the time showed so much sensitivity to the needs of people going through addiction recovery, through all of the stages from the initial detox to in-house treatment to sober living and on to medication-assisted treatment sometimes and then recovery support. All of that seemed to bind us together. What on earth could be the madness that inspires them to tear all that down now when they built it within the last decade with us?
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse, first of all, for all the work you put into passing that legislation, which has given access to millions of people across the country who are struggling with addiction and recovery, access to services. Again, I say what I said in my underlying remarks. There's not a single member of the Senate who doesn't have a close family member or a friend who has struggled or is struggling with addiction. This is a nonpartisan, apolitical problem. Addiction doesn't care if you're left, right, Republican, or Democrat. And we did come together around funding these programs. And so it is hard to understand, it is heartbreaking that I'm telling you the story of one of Connecticut's biggest addiction treatment providers, and they are telling us that if these cuts go through, fully 1/3 of their clients will lose access to some or all of those services. And to your point in your initial speech, Senator Whitehouse, I mean, maybe I could understand if we were deciding to cut funding for addiction treatment because we had some other really important priority that helped regular people. Like if we said, you know what, there's a housing crisis in this country, you know, right now we're going to have to borrow some money from addiction treatment in order to make sure that people get housed, or you know, our schools are underfunded and teachers need to be paid more, and okay, it's really hard to cut funding from addiction treatment centers, but at least we'll get, you know, better education for our kids. That's not what we're doing. We're cutting funds for people struggling with addiction who get served by programs that we agree are important in order to fund a tax cut for corporations and super, super rich people. That's why this is fundamentally immoral. I would
yield on that very point. There's a doctrine or a principle that it's kind of a tedious economic term, marginal utility of money. And what it means in very plain terms is that if you make $60,000 a year, your last $1,000 of income is a big deal to you. That $1,000 makes an enormous difference in the quality of your life. You take that same $1,000 and you give it to somebody who is making $60 billion a year, they don't even know it's there. The marginal utility of that money in the billionaire's or mega millionaire's life is near zero. Near zero. And so if you're actually looking at the human side of the financial equation, are we not taking extremely important dollars that make an enormous difference in the lives of normal, regular people, scooping them up by the trillions, according to the graphs I showed, and delivering them to a crop of big corporations who already pay taxes too low, and mega millionaires and billionaires who won't even notice the money. It won't change a thing in their lives. They can still buy a $90,000 purse for their wife. They can still buy the 9th house. They can still buy the 190-foot yacht with its crew of 30 or 40 or 50 or whatever it is. Where is the benefit? You know, we talk about this as being a transfer of wealth from the poor and the middle class to the very rich, but it's really an evaporation of wealth, because it's not going to make a difference to people who already have more money than they can spend in the rest of their lives. They couldn't spend it if they wanted to in the rest of their lives. And so this additional thing, it's more like a trophy. And it reminds me, when I was growing up, people talking about FDR, you know, recalling his presidency, and talking about JFK while he was president, and shortly thereafter. I was alive during JFK's life. And people used to say, well, you know, the good thing about electing those rich people is that they're too rich to steal. You don't have to worry about them. They're too rich to steal. FDR never stole a nickel, as best I can tell. JFK never stole a nickel, as best I can tell. This crop of creepy billionaires, what happened to too rich to steal, Senator Murphy?
I mean, and it's thievery masked by a bogus economic argument that says the money will eventually find its way down to everybody else. And that is not true. That has never been true. In fact, the opposite is often true. You know, the billionaire class is sometimes referred to as sort of citizens of everywhere, right? They're global citizens. They globetrot from homes in the United States and Europe and the islands. But that's also where their money ends up going as well. It used to be that the richest guy in your community was, you know, investing only in your community. But today, when we pad the pockets of the uber wealthy, that money either does not get spent or it ultimately gets delivered to investments that flow into economies all over the world. These tax cuts don't end up back in America. To the extent the money gets spent anywhere, it gets spent in international index funds. So the theory of the case, which has always been cover for simply delivering more and more excessive resources to the very, very wealthy, has never worked. But it works even less now when in a global international economy, the very, very wealthy have options to invest in the United States or often for higher returns, investing somewhere else.
And it looks to me, if I could reclaim my time for a moment and ask you another question, it looks to me a bit like as they're destroying Medicaid, which, as you pointed out, serves a quarter of American households and is essential in those households because it's granny's nursing home care, it's your sister's or wife's childbirth delivery in the hospital, or it's your colleague or friend or family member's opioid recovery treatment, swept away for unnecessary and unfair tax cuts to billionaires and big corporations. But then you move just beyond this immediate budget bill and you look over at Elon Musk and his little muskrats are doing to Social Security. And what they're saying about Social Security, and it looks like not only do they want to gut Medicaid through this budget reconciliation bill, but they also are trying to wreck the administration and operations of Social Security, trying to clear out the workforce that makes it work, sending their creeps in to probe into the data systems that support it. Who knows what damage has been done to the data systems or what extraction of data has been done? We don't know. They've never answered questions. They lie and say it's a Ponzi scheme. They refer to it as riddled with fraud when there's almost no fraud at all, 1% at best. So they're trying to discredit Social Security. They're trying to undermine its operations, and they're talking about an interruption in benefits. In fact, talking kindly about an interruption in benefits, with the Secretary of Commerce saying, if we had an interruption in benefits, my mother, who is a Social Security recipient, wouldn't even notice. Well, yeah, she's living in her billionaire son's house. Of course she wouldn't notice, duh. But the people who would complain about losing their check, that's probably fraudsters. And so it would actually be beneficial to have an interruption benefits, because that's how we could root out some of the fraud, like there is fraud. Again, feeding the lie that there is fraud. What conclusions do you reach when you see this pattern of activity targeting Social Security, even if an attack on it is not in this bill per se?
I thank Senator for the question. Listen, I read it as just a different kind of thievery. So what we're talking about here is this massive thievery from Medicaid recipients so that we can pass along this big tax break for folks that don't need it. But my sense is that the billionaire, investment, and Wall Street class is really upset that there are still a few remaining government programs that they haven't gotten their hands on, that they haven't operationalized in a way to make themselves money. They've had their eyes on Social Security for decades. Yep. You remember, George Bush proposing privatizing Social Security, which is essentially just taking that big lump of money and handing it to the investment managers so that they can skim some money off the top. They also look at schools the same way, I think, Senator Whitehouse. They've been discrediting public education to the point where now they don't think the Department of Education needs to exist. And why? Why? Because they ultimately want to do the same thing for our public schools. They want to privatize our elementary schools, our middle schools, our high schools, so that they can have private equity funds owning the schools, providing some form of education, but just seeing our kids as a source of profit. So you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but my sense is that the theft happens in all sorts of different ways, sometimes in just a transfer, Medicaid recipients losing, billionaires winning, but sometimes by taking government programs and turning them, instead of something that tries to work for the common good, as a program that just gets turned into a vehicle for profit for the very, very wealthy.
Particularly when there's so much money to be made and so much flows through Social Security. If you take it over by wrecking it and then sending in your private equity friends and tech bros to get it operational again, and then let them slice off a share for themselves by privatizing either it or its operations, you have created a massive new revenue stream for the super rich. So with that, I see that there are a few colleagues on the other side who have come over. It may be that it's their turn, so I will, Senator Murphy, you cool to yield the floor? I will yield the floor.